July 27th, 2024. It was a day like any other in the occupied Golan Heights. Although rockets and drones had regularly flown overhead since Hezbollah opened its support front in October of the last year, for the inhabitants of Majd al-Shams, this was no cause for alarm. When suddenly, a missile plummeted from the sky and landed in a small football field. 12 children were killed by the explosion, and dozens of others wounded. Conflicting reports began to emerge. The Israelis were quick to blame Hezbollah, claiming it as an intentional attack on civilians. Others, including eyewitnesses, cited a malfunctioning Iron Dome missile. Regardless, the Israeli propaganda machine went into full swing. They identified Hezbollah as the perpetrator and the victims as Israeli citizens, despite the fact that the occupants of Majd al-Shams are Syrian Druze, who have overwhelmingly refused Israeli citizenship and integration. Then, the Druze colors were pasted everywhere, from the State of Israel's own Twitter account, with text reading "We are all Druze," to the Druze flag being shown onto the Tel Aviv City Hall. 2 days after the attack, Netanyahu himself went to Majd al-Shams to supposedly mourn the victims. He was not met with open arms. The victims' families were part of the hundreds of protesters who called out his attempt to create war propaganda out of their grief. It was clear the Israelis were eager to use this incident as pretext. The very next day, Israel would conduct an airstrike in Beirut, assassinating the Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr, who was at the time the highest level member to be killed by Israel since October. It was around this time that the Israeli officials were saying that the center of gravity was shifting north. Just over a month later, on September the 17th, Israel carried out one of the largest terrorist operations in history in the form of the notorious pager attacks. This was to be the opening salvo that initiated the all-out Israeli aggression on Lebanon. I decided to start this video by talking about that incident in Majd al-Shams for two main reasons. One, I think it is such a clear example of how Israel weaponizes the Druze identity, regardless of those people's own positions, for its own goals and ambitions. And two, it was the first time that I found myself compelled to speak, not as a Lebanese or as a leftist, but as a member of the Druze community myself. Do you remember that tweet I just showed from the State of Israel's Twitter account? Well, at the time I responded, and this is what I said. As a Druze, you. Zionism has been a catastrophe for all of us in the region. You do not and never have represented us. Get your genocidal flag off of our colors. It was actually kind of a moment for me because I found myself ratioing the State of Israel's Twitter account. Their tweet got 16,000 likes, and my response to their tweet got 46,000. Small victories. But no, in all seriousness, it was that exact incident that brought a lot of new attention to the Druze community in general. And it's a very, very weird position for a lot of people to discover your, let's just say, very niche religious community, because the genocidal rogue state of Israel is using them to drum up war against the rest of your people. And so, without knowing anything else about the Druze, people would ask me questions like, are the Druze Zionists? Or be like, what about Israeli Druze? It's usually not in the form of questions, just accusations. These suspicions have only been amplified with the recent fighting in Swaydo, in which Israel did literally get involved by bombing Damascus as it claimed to protect the Druze. And some Druze leaders in Swaydo have called for further Israeli protection from the Nusra administration. Of these specific developments, I will talk more about it in a later stage of this video. But first, I want to talk about the Druze as a whole, because there is definitely a huge lack of understanding and awareness about these people who have existed in the region for 1,000 years. It's gotta be partly from this lack of understanding that I think a lot of people feel very comfortable painting an entire religious community in one color. Discourses that I feel very quickly become either sectarian or just outright racist. And I don't necessarily blame people for their ignorance. After all, the Druze do not amount to more than 2 million people worldwide. But more than that, if you've ever tried to dip your toe into it, maybe read the Wikipedia article or ask a few people, you've probably been a little confused because in many ways, the Druze are really, really interesting. But with that said, the only 2 English-speaking video essays that I have found about the Druze focus solely on the faith and its history, which I think misses the mark almost entirely for me. In a very structural way, the vast majority of Druze don't actually know all that much about their faith, and are more motivated by social, economic, and political factors. In my opinion, if you want to understand the Druze and how they fit within the region around them, you need to understand them through a historical and political lens. So, what I'm going to do in this video essay is talk about the Druze from 4 different levels: historically, religiously, socially, and politically. Accordingly, I've divided this video into chapters, so if you go down to the timeline here, you should be able to navigate. Let's say you want to skip a section, you just want to get to the politics, this will help you do that. And lastly, as a member of the Druze community, as a Dirze, I will of course be sharing my own personal reflections and experience and observations, especially when it comes to the sort of lived experience of coming from a Druze community and family. I am, however, also a Lebanese leftist, which to me means that I am deeply opposed to sectarianism and sectarian thinking. So you don't have to worry. Me being Druze does not mean that I am totally biased and can't see beyond the viewpoint of my own sect. As I always try to do, this video is rooted in a lot of research and a lot of reading, and as always, all of my sources will be in the show notes. Some of them I'll mention over the course of the video. And one last thing, I promise this is the last thing, and you'll know it because, hello, welcome to the second video of my channel. The last video I did on Christian Zionism did exceptionally well. I am very surprised, and I thank everybody who not only watched it, left comments, boosted it, but also donated and supported me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to continuing making more of these types of videos. And if you want to help me do so, then the best way you can do that is go to my Ko-fi, which is basically my tip jar. And even like a small donation of like $5 to $10, whatever. Like it just adds a lot. It also boosts my ego because it's like, hey, people are listening and they like the stuff that I'm saying enough that they're willing to give me money. Aside from that, if you can't support financially, like and subscribe. You know the drill. You've been on YouTube. Tell your friends and family, yada yada. So, with that said, let's begin. When doing my initial research for this video, I noticed that there's just so much straight up incorrect information online about the early formations of the Druze faith. The Wikipedia page, which is to me always the first source I go to, is kind of useless. So what I'm going to do is provide a brief overview But if you want a real deep dive into the early formations, the best book I have found is called A History of the Druzes by Palestinian Druze scholar Firro. The book doesn't just focus on the early history, but leads you up to essentially the middle of the 20th century. It talks about the faith. I really recommend it. This is the best book that I have found overall. So the Druze emerged during the Fatimid Caliphate, which ruled much of North Africa and the Levant between the 10th and 12th century AD. It was the only expansive Muslim caliphate to be headed by Shia Muslims, specifically Ismaili Shias. The difference between Sunni, Shia, and Ismailis is, let's just say, beyond the scope of this video. But it's enough to say that these were the three main branches of Islam that existed at the time, and the differences between them were both theological and political. The Fatimids, for their part, promoted a kind of intellectual and esoteric interpretation of Islam, which they spread through missionaries across the caliphate. This is also a period described as a cultural, intellectual, and philosophical flourishing in the region, part of what's referred to as the Islamic Golden Age. In Egypt, the Fatimids patronized intellectual activities. They founded major libraries in Cairo, and throughout their efforts, the Fatimid capital became a flourishing center of Islamic scholarship, sciences, art, and culture, in addition to playing a prominent role in international trade and commerce. The sixth Fatimid caliph, who came to power at the age of 11, which is wild, was called Al-Hakim bi Amar Allah. It was under his rule that the Druze would be born, specifically by one of his most important and loyal missionaries, a man named Hamza ibn Ali ibn Ahmad. In 1017 AD, Hamza was named Imam by Al-Hakim and announced what's known as the Divine Call, or Dawah. This was basically a call for different communities across the Caliphate to engage in a reinterpretation of the Quran and Islam in general, especially to focus more on its monotheistic aspects. The call mostly targeted educated elites, philosophers, and what are described as spiritually inclined individuals. Some see this call as an effort to reform Islam. Some see it as a call to create a new sect within it. Others saw this as the start of a new religion entirely. Regardless, it is this call, this dawah, that marks the beginning of the Druze faith. Soon, you had many different groups across North Africa and the Levant that took up this call. What essentially formed, if I want to describe this in modern terms, is the formation of little separate but interconnected cults across the region. I say cult not to be insulting or disrespectful. Rather, I believe that all institutions we today call religions originally started as cults and then grew big and became institutions. One of the missionaries under Al-Hakim was a man named Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Dirze. The historiography around him is a bit difficult to navigate because it seems like almost everybody hated him, and so it's really hard to parcel what is shitposting in a historical sense and what is accurate. What's written about him is that he was one of these missionaries that was leading the call that Hamza made, but he thought that he should have been Imam, not Hamza. And what follows is that his methods of gaining power and spreading the call were looked down upon even by his colleagues. Basically, they say that he tried to undermine Hamza and even tried to portray himself as a prophet. For all this and possibly more, Al-Dirze was executed by Al-Hakim. But regardless, his notoriety was so powerful that all people who accepted the divine call were seen as associating with him, and so the name stuck. The Druze get their name from a man who they consider the first apostate of their faith. It's for this reason that the Druze also refer to themselves not just as Druze, but as Al-Muwahhidin Druze, the Druze monotheists, to A, distance themselves from this association with Al-Dirze, but also to reassert what they're actually all about, monotheism. So back to the chronology. Al-Hamza continues spreading the call, writing about his interpretations and his ideas. These texts are known as epistles, and they would later be compiled and are essentially what is the Druze canon, a book known as Al-Hikmah. These activities go on for a few years until 1021 AD, when the Caliph, Al-Hakim, mysteriously disappears during one of his regular evening walks. Some historians say that he was most likely executed, but religiously, to the Druze and the Ismailis, they believe that he went into occultation, as in, he is gone, but he will return in the end times. And strangely enough, it seems, soon after, Hamza, the Imam of the Divine Call, also died, but not before naming his successor, a man named Baha al-Din al-Muqtana. The caliph who took over after Al-Hakim absolutely hated all of the stuff he was doing. He saw it as frivolous, as eccentric, and essentially blasphemic, and so began clamping down on the nascent Druze followers. This was to be the first of several waves of persecution against these new believers that forced the members and the preachers to go underground. For 20 years, the preachers would preach, accept new converts, and then go into hiding as the new authorities cracked down on their solicitous behavior. Then, in 1043 AD, Baha al-Din closed the Divine Call. All who accepted the call were in, and from that point on, no one was able to join the new faith. And so what that means, if you can believe it, is that every Druze person today is a direct descendant of these people who 1,000 years ago, within a span of like 26 years, accepted this call to reform and accept this new faith. But it should be noted that most communities who initially accepted the call were crushed or reconverted. With that said, the Fatimid leaders were unable to quell the spread in the mountainous regions of what we today call Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. This is where Druze still remain to this day. So there's obviously a lot more to this history, especially in the intervening 1,000 years. But that's the history of how the faith came about, and it is the joint history of basically all the Druze. The rest of their history, that is, the modern history, I'll talk about in the last section, because I think it relates much more to their political roles within the region. And so before we go to the next section and talk about religion, I want to demonstrate a bit about the geography of where Druze live. And in order to do that, I found this very neat chart that I think kind of sums up a lot of this information concisely. But instead of me just talking about it, I figured, hello. I did this in the last video essay, and I just thought it was really neat, so I figured I'd do it again for this chart, even though it's not going to take as long for sure, because there's just not that much information here. So, this is a chart, as you can see up here, that shows the religious composition of the Levant region. Over here is the legend, the key, and it has different colors for each of the main religious groups and symbols that you mostly see in the urban areas because they're very mixed, so you can't really see without those symbols. So for our purposes, we want to focus on the purple areas because in this chart, purple is Druze, even though purple has no significance as a color in the Druze faith. I don't know why they chose it. The only colors that do have significance you can see in the Druze star. It's like green, red, white, blue, and yellow. And each one of those have something related to like the emanations of God I don't know if I'll get into it that much in the religion section because it's quite deep. But regardless, in this chart, we want to look for the Druze stars or for purple. And so we'll start first with Syria. So Syria has the largest amount of Druze people of any country in the world. The largest concentration of those Druze are down here in the southern province of Swayda. It's estimated that there are about 700,000 to 1 million Druze people living in Syria. Census data is not very clear, so take all these numbers with a grain of salt. The next area in Syria with a substantial Druze population is over here, which you can see is basically in the outskirts of Damascus. Most notably, one of the areas is known as Germano, which you may have heard in the news lately. The next area with a Druze population in Syria that I did not know about was up here. Not just Aleppo, which has a lot of ethnic and religious minorities, but also over here in the north of Idlib. I just didn't know that there were Druze living there. Also, one thing I learned from this chart, because when I saw the Druze star by Palmyra, I was a bit confused. I couldn't find any census info about people who live near this area, but I did find that one of the ruins, the castle, if you remember 2015, ISIS took over this area and they destroyed an ancient monument like ruins. That castle was actually named after Fakhr ad-Din, a Druze emir of the 16th century from Mount Lebanon. The next country with a large Druze population and which has areas that are majority Druze areas is Lebanon. And you can see over here the purple that is just outside of Beirut. That is Mount Lebanon, well, part of it, the Shuf area, Alay, and there are also large numbers of Druze living in Beirut itself. Aside from that area, if you look a bit more south, over here you'll see another large sort of purple area with a lot of Druze, and that are like Druze majority areas, and that's to like the southwest of the country. It's described as the west of the Ba'a Valley, and the two main areas of it are known as Hasbaya and Rashaya. In Lebanon, it's estimated that about 5% of the population are Druze, meaning anywhere between 200 to 300,000 people. The next area with a lot of Druze, I don't have to move my face too much, is over here in the north of Palestine, most notably in the Galilee region. And there are also a large number of Druze living in the city of Haifa. The next place I'll note is over here in the occupied Golan Heights. You'll notice that you see a lot of orange. Those are illegal Jewish settlements in this illegally occupied Syrian territory. But you'll notice that there are purple. These are the Druze areas, or rather Druze majority areas, within the Golan Heights. And in Palestine, there are only about 150,000 or so Palestinians living within this occupied territory that includes the Golan Heights. All the census figures are compiled by the State of Israel, so they conflate the two. The only other place in this region you'll notice that has some Druze is over here in Jordan, but it seems like there's such a small minority, it's like 5 people. That is a joke, obviously, but the only census data I found indicate between like 20 to 30,000, which is like 0.2% of the total population. Aside from that, the only other Druze populations are those living in the diaspora, in the Gulf, in Europe, and in like North and South America. And so I hoped you enjoyed this presentation of the geography of the Druze in the Levant. So, this is where it gets interesting. One of the many reasons you may not have heard anything about the Druze is, as I mentioned, we're not taking any new members. Ever since the call ended in 1043, that's it. No one can convert into it, only born into it. Or rather, reborn into it. I'll get into that in a second, I promise. But so basically what that means is there's no real need for the Druze to talk that much about their faith publicly because They're not trying to convince anyone of anything. But of course, for the sake of education, I think it's important for people to at least understand the main parts of the Druze faith, especially for those who talk about the Druze within the context of regional politics. So building off of what I mentioned in the previous section, the period within which the Druze faith emerged was one that many describe as a spiritual and intellectual revolution. Druze beliefs emerge from this atmosphere, and so build off of the already existing Abrahamic religions, with its own interpretation and ideas. The core theme within Druze theology is monotheism, the oneness of God. Thus, to the Druze, there is not one single prophet who bore this message, but rather a succession of revelations of monotheism that have been presented to us humans through numerous recognized prophets, the same prophets as in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and ultimately Hamza. But the Druze interpretation of monotheism in many ways goes beyond these other conceptions, which they claim as either too literal or in some cases contradictory. For instance, in all other Abrahamic religions, it is said that God created the universe, the heavens, and the earth. On this, the Druze scholar Sami Makarem, no relation, writes this: with its intellectual foundation and revolutionary spirit, the Druze doctrine could not be satisfied with this concept of God. It did not believe that God is only above this existence, but that God is existence itself. For if God were only beyond and only higher than this universe, then he would be limited by the universe, since the universe would be outside of him. How then can God be one when there is something outside of him? Yeah, the Druze go hard on their monotheism. I'm sure there are a lot of people who are much more familiar with these Abrahamic theologies, whether Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, and see what I just read and think, well, that's not that different from our conceptions. But that's exactly the point. The Druze are not an entirely new religion, but rather they are embedded and expanding upon the already existing Abrahamic traditions. They're just much more like laser focused on monotheism of and in itself. To that end, the Druze made a series of changes that they saw as either contravening or as distractions from the monotheistic beliefs. They forbade both slavery and polygamy, which were widely practiced in the region in the 11th century. They also abolished the hereditary imamate system, which created a hierarchy under the guise of divine guidance. The Druze also basically stopped doing most religious practices and activities. Communal prayer, sermons, fasting, pilgrimage, basically everything. The way that Hamza ibn Ali describes the Druze faith, I think, sums up this point very concisely. Of the Druze faith, he describes it as a spiritual doctrine without any ritualistic imposition. And it's because of this, we Druze don't really have any holidays. Well, we have one, and it's Eid al-Adha, which marks Abraham's sacrifice of his son to God or something, and it can be understood basically as a monotheistic holiday. So, the other major thing that sets the Druze apart from other Abrahamic religions is their belief in reincarnation. Yes, the Druze believe in reincarnation. Actually, little known fact, they're not the only ones in the region who believe so. Both the Alawites and the Yazidis believe in reincarnation as well. But yes, the Druze believe that after we die, our souls go into another body and we are reborn again. Our memories do not transfer over, and so we do not remember anything about our past lives, but there are some stories, especially from children, or of children, who have recollections that their families, especially in the society around them, believes are restored memories. Firro, the Palestinian Druze scholar, outlines a lot of these beliefs very concisely. All human souls were created at once, their number fixed for all time. A soul cannot be detached from the human body, which serves as the vestment of the soul. Upon the death of the body, the soul immediately settles in a new human body. This transmigration enables the soul to pass through every possible human experience and condition, health and illness, wealth and poverty. Transmigration, therefore, grants human beings equal opportunities, through which God's justice is vindicated. A human being's only choice is between right and wrong. The process of transmigration goes on until the Last Judgment, whereupon every soul will be evaluated for its deeds and for its adherence to the Unitarian concept. Believing in true Unitarianism, the soul frees itself from deficiencies and at last attains completion. Growing up in a Druze family, I've always had so many questions about this. Do we have a concept of karma? Do non-Druze also reincarnate? How many times will it happen? What's the endgame scenario like? There is one word that I think, more than any, defines the actual experience of growing up thinking critically within a Druze family. It's a word I haven't seen once in this research. You won't find it in any book or in any of these other video essays. And that word is hasab. It just means depends, as in depends who you ask. Every single time I've asked a question to my mother, my father, my uncles, my grandparents, they tell me the exact same thing. Hasab. Do non-Druze reincarnate? Hasab. Even pretty fundamental questions like, are the Druze its own religion, or are we a sect of Islam? Hasab. Some say yes, some say no. Do you remember when I said at the beginning that you probably don't know that much about the Druze faith? Well, the truth is, most Druze don't either. They know about the monotheism, they know about reincarnation, but aside from that, genuinely very little else. And the reasons for this, I think, are very, very interesting and reveal a lot about the religion as a whole. So, firstly, there is a sharp distinction between the sheikhs and everyone else. Sheikhs are learned individuals of the religion. They're sort of similar to, but should not be confused as a clergy, which I'll talk about in a moment. Druze sheikhs live modest lives, they wear traditional clothing, and they dedicate themselves, and they dedicate their lives to the learning and studying of the Druze faith. They do hold prayers together in areas of isolation and read not just from the holy Druze book, Al-Hikmah, but also other religious texts as well. Technically, the sheikhs are the only people who are allowed to read from the Hikmah. And interestingly enough, sheikhs can be both male and female, as in sheikhs and sheikhas. Now, it's estimated that if you were to divide the Druze population on these terms, it's about 10 to 15% in any one area are Druze sheikhs. Now, for the rest of us
have nothing.
The vast majority of Druze, we are known as the uninitiated. My favorite term, which is a bit outdated, is al-jihal, the ignorant. So we do not read from the holy book. We are technically not allowed to. We don't pray. We don't dedicate time to religion, because as far as the sheikhs believe, it would be lost on us anyway, so there's no point in even trying, unless we're going to dedicate our lives to it. But if we do have questions, the sheikhs are accessible. They're not like a secluded whatever. They're part of the community. You can go ask them anything. But as far as I've seen, people only tend to do that in moments of crises and conflict. So between this split between the Mashaykh and the uninitiated, let's just call them, the former go deep into the religion, and the latter don't get involved at all. Like, functionally for everyone else, it's just believe in the oneness of God, believe in reincarnation, and be a good person, essentially. But aside from that, most Druze don't know anything about, some of these ins and outs of the religion. For instance, some of the stuff that I quoted above from the Firro book or the Sami Makarem book, I'd never read before. I'd had to discover a lot while doing this research. The second reason most Druze don't know much about their religion is the holy book, essentially the Druze canon, al-Hikmah, is not in wide circulation, unlike the Quran or the Bible, and again is basically reserved for sheikhs. No one I know has actually read the book, and either way the book isn't the most accessibly written. The point is that it needs to be protected because it is difficult to interpret, and people who are not well studied may interpret it incorrectly, spread false information about the religion, and potentially bring on, suspicions or persecutions. And so as a result of this, for some of these deeper questions, a lot of people just make things up as they go along. And so I remember during my new atheism phase, I asked my mother a gotcha question. I asked her, first of all, so we reincarnate, right? She said, yeah. And I said, there are only a finite amount of souls. She said, yes. And I said, so how do you account for the rising Druze population if there are only a finite amount of souls? She stopped for a second, and I swear to God, she gave an answer that, bless her heart, I think is just so... She's a very smart person. Because she said, well, how do you know we're the only Druze in the universe? And I was like, oh, yeah, I don't think that's what's written. I don't think that's the common held belief. But in that context, and especially in this very esoteric religion, that could be an answer. And it kind of does work. What if there are Druze in a planet, 1,000 light years away? They have a declining population. I love that story. The third reason why a lot of Druze do not know much about the religion is we have no mass. We have no Sunday school. We have no religious learning, no holy buildings. Literally, there is no Druze equivalent to the mosque or the temple or the church. I remember a few years ago when I went to the funeral of my great aunt, Allah yarhamah, we were in this large auditorium with absolutely no decoration, only except for three things: the Druze star, the portrait of the father and the son, Kamal Jumblat and Walid Jumblat, two political figures who are part of the Druze sect but are not religious figures in that sense. We do have some holy sites, but they're very spread out across the regions that we're a part of, and they're largely inaccessible, especially the ones that are within 48 Palestine. I do remember once we went as a family to a holy site in Lebanon, but I was 14, I didn't care. I don't remember anything significant. It was just a kind of a plot of land in the mountains with some abandoned ruin buildings. But aside from that, nothing that remarkable. The most notable holy site must be the one for Jethro, which is in 48 Palestine, which therefore is completely inaccessible to me. So the fourth reason, as I sort of implied a bit earlier, the Druze do not have an established clergy. There is some hierarchy just based on seniority amongst the sheikhs, but it's nothing like the hierarchies you see in Islam and Christianity with these different levels that ultimately lead to some grand authority. We just don't have that. And so what this means is that there is no central religious authority. We don't have anything close to a pope, where it's sort of this large religious figure who says this is what it is and everyone should abide. And so what this does is it creates a lack of centralized knowledge. And again, that's why to me the term hasab, depends, is so ubiquitous in some of these discussions that I've had growing up. This sheikh says that, but that sheikh says this, and the sheikh over there says that, on and on. The fifth reason I think sums up a lot of my attitudes towards the Druze is that ultimately there is just a lack of interest in religious affairs amongst most Druze. And it's that way structurally. Like, the whole point is that looking into this stuff and really trying to understand divination, God, the universe, all these things, it'll take your lifetime to figure out. And so if you're not really going to spend that much time doing it, don't bother. Just be a good person. And essentially, that's what being a non-sheikh Druze is all about. Like, it's all about respecting your elders, taking care of your community, engaging literally in mutual aid. And with that, the belief in monotheism and reincarnation. But aside from that, you don't really have any other religious duties. And I kind of like that. But lastly, and this I find very interesting, is that the justifications and arguments for, let's say, the existence of reincarnation are usually anecdotal or societal and not theological. What I mean by that is it's never been the case that I ask about reincarnation and someone tells me, oh, well, if you look at Leviticus 13:1, if you look at this, we don't have that. And so what it actually is stories within communities that are very similar across communities. I've talked to Druze from Sweden, from Palestine, and I've noticed that there are very similar themes across all of these stories. Stories such as children who go into a house for the first time, immediately as they're playing around, go under the bed, lift a floorboard, find the deeds of the house that the family had been looking for since the elder passed away. And they see this as a sign that that boy must be a reincarnation of that elder. If you notice, none of this has a theological basis. These are societally held and reinforced beliefs. All these reasons put together is why I prefer to understand, and I think it is more helpful to understand, the Druze as a social entity that have a shared history and have a shared religious belief. But what really ties them together is societal and communal ties. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. That is the next section. Before I get into that, I just want to give two references that you can look into further if you want to learn more about the Druze faith as a faith. The first one is a book called The Druze Faith by Sami Makarem. Again, no relation. This I found an interesting but altogether not a very easy book to read, and it also feels like it's very much written with an insider bias. That is to say that it is not a writer writing about the Druze faith, but a Druze believer describing their own faith. And so there's this mix between description and his own beliefs. It kind of melds in, which I find a bit difficult, especially when trying to research. But regardless, as far as I have found, it is the most in-depth about the faith itself, and includes a lot of references to the epistles, to the Druze canon. And the one video essay, which is by a very popular channel called Religion for Breakfast, it's alright. It's not as deep as I think it could have gone, but it's definitely a good introduction, and will definitely help situate, if you are interested in theology and are interested in religion, I think that's a good place to start. But again, my main thing about that is I don't think it's a very helpful way to understand the Druze, because most Druze don't really know this stuff. And so in order to understand them, we need to think a bit socially. Naturally, it's difficult to talk about Druze society as a single thing, since there are, of course, quite different communities that are spread around the region. Since I come from Lebanon, I can only really speak to that experience. And even then, it's not like I'm here being like, this is how the Druze of Lebanon live, because again, I'm limited to my own experience. Druze society, I'd say, is very similar to most other Arab societies around them. We speak Arabic, we eat pretty much the same foods, we're very communally minded. The only differences are kind of minor. If there's one question that I get asked more than any other by non-Druze Lebanese, it's, is it true that you don't eat ملوخية?
صحيح الملوخية محرمة؟
For those that don't know, ملوخية is this very dense herb that we cook as a stew and eat with chicken and rice. It's not my favorite dish, but in my family, we do eat it. But apparently, some people don't. Again, hasab. In many ways, at the local level, Druze society, like a lot of similar small dwellings in the region, is quite feudal. There is still a lot of focus on notable families and on reputations. The Druze also practice something called endogamy, meaning they can only marry from within the religion. The societal effects of this obviously are many, but I think it really reinforces and maintains this quasi-feudal system. But ultimately, it means that these communities are quite tight-knit and very familiar with everyone and all the families in a certain area. I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it's pretty much true. Whenever I meet another Druze Lebanese, it usually takes us between 5 to 10 minutes to find out how we're related. To me, one of the most interesting aspects of Druze society is that sheikhs don't get paid to be sheikhs. They also labor. They have jobs. It's not uncommon in a Druze village to see sheikhs working as farmers, as grocers, as pharmacists, as butchers, what have you. Because although sheikhs do tend to have social influence within the society, they mostly do not have economic or political power. The vast majority of sheikhs do not get involved in politics, and their positions as sheikhs do not inherently bestow upon them any political power. One thing I completely forgot to mention is that Druze sheikhs actually have an exclusive hand greeting. There, did you see that? Basically, it's a way that sheikhs greet other sheikhs, wherein they shake hands and then kiss, in unison, the other sheikh's hand. I don't know, it might seem like a random insert, but I personally find it so cool. And as far as I know, it's pretty unique. But aside from all that, the advent of capitalist modernity, especially in the last 50 years, has changed a lot about Druze society. From my own personal observations, the social classes that emerge from these new economic realities have mostly actually reinforced the social relations within Druze societies. That is, yesterday's feudal lord is today's wealthy businessman or architect. While the economic sources may have changed, the social relations, to do with these class relations, seem pretty much still feudal in nature. Sorry to get all Marxist all of a sudden, but this is an observation I've had for a long time. But yes, with urbanization and centralization, many Druze have moved away from the village towards urban centers, be it Beirut, Damascus, or Haifa. Beyond this, many Druze have left their countries altogether, scattered across the Arabian Gulf, North and South America, and Europe. That's me. It's actually a funny thing that I ended up in Vienna, because one of the most famous, if not the most famous, Druze artist of all time, Asmahan, once sung a song titled Lonely Nights in Vienna. But yes, My impression of Druze society is that it is largely apolitical, focused on the community and people's awareness of their social roles and functions within that community. With that said, I am very proud to say that the very first bank to be set on fire in Lebanon during the 2019 revolution was in my hometown in the mountains, which otherwise is a very quiet place. This comes in the context of the banking sector having had collapsed, and many of these banks, all of these banks, closing everyone's accounts and essentially stealing people's life savings. Only 2 weeks after the incident in my hometown did we see what is now known as the Night of the Banks, in which over the course of hours, protesters in Hamra, in the midst of Beirut, right across from the central bank, destroyed numerous bank franchises, breaking down windows and setting some of them alight. This, I think, brings us very neatly into the last part of this video. So it's a little tricky talking about Druze politics, because, as I said in the last section, the Druze are not a monolith. And so when talking about a religious community, especially one that is split between 3 different national borders and spread out across the region, it's hard to talk about one body politic, and therefore one political tendency and the like. So what I'm going to do in this section is talk about the different Druze communities, the main political tendency within them, and the role that they as communities, but also leaders that came from those communities, played in the region, especially in the last 500 years, the modern history, let's say. There are some cross-national discussions, but there's no real connection politically between the Druze in Lebanon with those in Syria and with those in 48 Palestine. So what I'll do is talk about each one of those 4, including the occupied Golan Heights, because they do have their own story, in this section. And this section is split up into those 4. And I'll talk about their history and leading up to the present moment. But before I go deep into each individual community, I do have some brief observations of a sort of historical political tendency that is sort of connected with all the Druze communities. One, the Druze have never expressed a desire to unify across borders, to create Druzestan, for example. Instead, Druze engagements in politics almost always is involved within a national context, and is either allied or opposed to things happening within the respective country. And with that said, despite their incredibly small size, the Druze have played a major role in the political history of the Levant as a whole. Not to mention within national struggles, specifically in Lebanon and Syria. The third theme that I noticed throughout Druze history is that Druze political engagement seems to mostly center around autonomy. Dug deep within this very mountainous region, the Druze historically have tended to oppose foreign rule and be some of the first to fight against it. Obviously, there is one main exception to that, and we'll get to that shortly. And so, lastly, before I split this into the respective locales, again, another disclaimer that we should avoid thinking in sectarian terms, because oftentimes there are leaders that do not represent the people that they claim to represent, and so their actions do not necessarily represent the whole community. And so I will make a distinction when I talk about some of these people and movements that there is a distinction between Druze elites and Druze emirs and Druze populations. Because as we've seen in many cases, those two are not aligned at all. So, let's begin. First on the list, Lebanon. As I said at the outset, the Druze make up about 5% of the Lebanese population, but have played a major role in the country's history. With the onset of the Ottoman occupation of Lebanon, following its conquest of the region in 1516, there had always been conflicts between local tribes and communities and local feudal lords and the new Ottoman imperial overlords. A lot of these conflicts had to do with taxes, with subordination, and in a later stage, conscriptions. And so only a few decades after the Ottomans took control of Mount Lebanon and the region, there was this upstart emir known as Fakhr ad-Din. Fakhr ad-Din was a Druze emir, which basically means like a feudal lord, who went on to create what is essentially now known as a proto-Lebanese state. It definitely wasn't a state like we understand it today, because again, we're talking about the 16th century, but it was kind of an expanded area of autonomy from Ottoman rule. And that mostly means that local elites were able to tax the peasantry without giving too much to the Ottomans. And as you can see in this picture, the territory that Fakhr ad-Din essentially took from the Ottomans and ruled as an autonomous area was quite extensive. It ranged from Akka in Palestine to Latakia in the west coast of Syria. But again, this was a period before there was even these national conceptions of Lebanon as distinct from Syria, as distinct from Palestine. And so what Fakhr ad-Din did in this process is basically begin the very idea of Lebanon. Whether that was a good or bad thing, that's a discussion for another time, but it definitely was significant. Over the course of this period, for the next 100 or 200 so years, this region would be controlled by a Druze-Maronite dualism. And this dualism of power sharing between these two religious communities and their elites most specifically eventually led to a very violent outburst in 1860. Many people claim this as Lebanon's first civil war, which mostly took place within Mount Lebanon, but expanded beyond it, and saw massacres of both Druze and Christian populations. The history of this event and what follows is quite intense and quite detailed, and if anyone wants to read more about it, I highly recommend Fawaz Trabulsi's book, The Modern History of Lebanon. The next major political, social, economic event to befall the Druze of Mount Lebanon has to be the famine that occurred between 1915 to 1918. This famine didn't just affect Druze, it affected everybody in Mount Lebanon and spreading across in the valleys, and it's estimated 50% of the population perished in this famine. There's a lot of reasons why this famine happened. Partly it's the Ottomans, partly it's the European blockade, partly because there was a locust swarm in the sort of like harvest season in I think 1917. But this is definitely something that marks this period that can't be discounted when thinking politically. Because then, after the Ottoman Empire collapses and the French and British divide up the region through the secretly negotiated Sykes-Picot Agreement, France takes control of Lebanon and the Syrian interior, as it's described back then. The Druze did not resist French mandate domination, not in the same way that Syrian Druze did, which we'll talk about in the next section. But essentially this period is marked with kind of laying low and bargaining for the protection of their own autonomy. One of the most key figures in Druze political history, but also in the history of Lebanon, was a Druze man named Kamal Jumblat. Jumblat came from a very noble and historic family. He was, by all means, a leftist politician who held high-ranking positions in several post-independent governments. He founded a political party called the Progressive Socialist Party, with its logo showing a chisel and a pen, which as a leftist writer, I do like this flag, although, yeah. And most notably about Kamal Jumblat is that he helped form, and he was the main leader of the Lebanese National Movement, which was a coalition of leftists, Arab nationalists, and Palestinian-aligned groups within Lebanon. They were also very heavily tied and allied with the PLO. And so Kamel Jumblat was a really important person within Lebanese political history because he was trying to abolish the sectarian system. And by allying with Palestinian groups, we're showing a keen awareness of the struggles against sectarian oligarchy and against Zionist imperialism as two faces of the same struggle for Arab and Palestinian liberation. I don't have time in this video to explain what exactly the sectarian system in Lebanon is. That would be a whole section in itself. I actually did do a video essay about Arab nationalism, wherein I talk about just that, and I'll put it in the description below. And so it's enough to say that Kamel Jumblat was a very influential, important, and in my eyes, progressive force rarely seen within Lebanese politics. Kamel Jumblat was also one of the main players in 1975 that initiated the civil war. Some even go as far as to blame him for starting the civil war. Others see his claims and his ideas for armed struggle against the state as a necessary means of bringing about the reforms that otherwise were not able to get through using political and diplomatic channels. And so, to just say very concisely, the Lebanese Civil War began in 1975 as an effort to either destroy and dismantle sectarianism or to protect it. Kamel Jumblat, the Lebanese National Movement, and the Palestinian Fedayeen were for the former, and the Christian far right, specifically the Kata'ib or the Phalange, were for the latter. This can sometimes be seen as a split between the left and the right. And important to note, the Lebanese National Movement was also cross-sectarian. You had Sunni and Shia Muslims, you had Christians of several denominations, you had Druze, and the like. And so, in 1976, Hafiz al-Assad invades Lebanon to defend the far-right Christian Kata'ib party against the Lebanese National Movement and the Palestinian Fedayeen. And not a year into that invasion, Kamel Jumblat is abducted and assassinated. All clues point to the fact that he was killed by the Syrian regime. After Kamel Jumblat's assassination, his son takes over, who, although looks quite old, was only like 27 at the time. Now, if Kamel Jumblat was a man of integrity, Walid Jumblat was anything but. Not only would he flip-flop alliances and allegiances throughout the rest of the war, he would also turn the PSP, the Progressive Socialist Party, into a fully sectarian party around him. His party and its armed wing also did commit massacres, especially during the War of the Mountains in the early 80s. This is not negating the fact that the Christian militias also committed massacres against the Druze, but we have to remark that Walid Jumblat is a warlord from the Civil War era.
كان هدفهم محاولة طرد هؤلاء من بيوتهم ومنازلهم عبر مجازر وغير مجازر للوصول إلى جو صافي مذهبي. فشلوا.
ورددتم بمجازر مثلها.
وردنا الحرب، من قال أن الحرب هناك حروب نظيفة وهناك حروب غير نظيفة؟ الحرب هي حرب. كالعادات اللبنانية الأصيلة أو العربية من أي جهة أتت كان لابد من غزو، فغزونا، هم غزوا ونحن غزونا.
والأبرياء يدفعون الثمن.
والأبرياء يدفعون الثمن.
And although at first he is allied with the Palestinians, after his father is killed by the Syrians, and the Syrians begin to dominate Lebanon, he begins to ally with the Syrians. But yes, what we can say is that he's always been opposed to Israel and to Zionism. But aside from that, his legacy is quite sketchy. Walid Jumblat also became a very wealthy individual. The exact number we don't know, but we do know that he owns a lot of real estate within the country. So much for progressive socialism. Since the end of the Civil War in 1990, Walid Jumblatt has continued to play an important role in Lebanese politics. He was known for a while as the Kingmaker, since his party would be able to sway the votes to decide which coalition would enter power. In 2005, he joined the March 14 movement against the Syrian regime and its allies in the country, and advocated for the expulsion of the Syrian regime from Lebanon. His politics throughout this period is marked by political pragmatism, and mostly focuses on maintaining his own local power as the head of the PSP. In 2023, Walid Jumblatt announced his withdrawal from politics, and named his eldest son, Taimur, as the new head of the party. However, little has changed after this announcement, as he is very much still the head of the PSP, and his statements carry significant political weight, in Lebanon and in relation to the rest of the region. After the fall of the Syrian regime, Jumblatt visited Ahmed al-Shara in Damascus and advocated for the integration of the Suwaida province into the new Syrian state. He has been vocally opposed to Israeli intervention in Syria, seeing it as a Zionist attempt to use the Druze to fracture the Syrian state. And finally, Jumblatt was in favor of Hezbollah's support front, which opened up on October 8, 2023, but after the escalation of the aggression and the defeats Hezbollah faced, Jumblatt has stated that the party is no longer able to confront Israel and has since advocated for all armed groups in the country to hand over their weapons to the state. At the current moment, the Jumblatts are the most notable and important Druze politicians in the country. The only other two are a guy named Emir Arslan, who leads a very kind of small party that's kind of just in opposition to Jumblatt's party. And then you have Wa'am Wahab, who, above all else, is just a meme factory of a man, but his politics are incomprehensible.
أول مرة بحكيها كنت تركها لبعدين للتاريخ. أحمد شغيل عند بشار. شو يعني؟
But like all political elites in Lebanon, their views and their positions do not necessarily reflect those of the average constituent. Like all people in Lebanon, the Druze are struggling under conditions of economic collapse and of political and military insecurity, just to put it lightly. Although the PSP is still a largely popular party amongst the Druze, that has much more to do with its capture of the political space and the entire oligarchical sectarian system within which it's very much a part of. That is to say, it is hard to literally manifest a new party outside of the sectarian system. So I think all in all, the Druze in Lebanon prioritize their own autonomy, but have also been very heavily involved with the country's politics since independence, and even before. Politically, the Druze in Lebanon are heavily opposed to the State of Israel and to Zionism. Not only have we seen what the Israelis have done to Lebanon, but also what they have been doing for an even longer time and in even more intensely forms of cruelty, violence, and occupation to our Arab kin Palestinians in 48 Palestine, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon as well. And so I think that's that for Lebanon. Oh, and in case you're wondering, yes, Walid Jumblatt did do an interview for Playboy magazine in 1984 in the midst of the war. So the political history of the Druze in Syria is kind of similar to that of Lebanese, but in many ways, they went a lot harder. In Syria, they make up no more than 3% of the total population, and again likewise have played a very significant role in the country's history. One of the most important figures in Syrian national history is a Druze revolutionary by the name of Sultan Pasha al-Atrash. Sultan was born in 1891 in a small town in the south of Swaida, to the noble Al-Atrash family. His father fought against the Ottomans in the 1909 rebellion in response to increasingly harsh policies, forced conscriptions, and violent crushing of the nascent Arab nationalist movement. A lot of people don't know this, or maybe they just forget, but towards the end there, the Ottoman Empire was suffering from a lot of internal crises, and in many ways they tried to salvage their losses by further exploiting communities that it still, at least nominally, had control over. Sultan Pasha al-Atrash and Druze forces within Swaida were part of the forces that liberated Damascus from Ottoman rule in 1918 as part of the Great Arab Rebellion. After the war, and after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the French took control of Syria as part of its mandate system. And although there were similar tensions and issues that the Lebanese Druze faced, and Lebanese communities faced under the French, in 1925, there was something called the Great Syrian Revolt against the French mandate, which lasted for 2 years. It started in response to the French mandate's attempt at carving up the country into many little different states, as you see in this picture here. What the revolutionaries were demanding, though, was complete independence, which the European powers had promised the Arabs, only to betray them, and take over the regions for themselves. And so Sultan Pasha al-Atrash was one of the main leaders of this revolt. And it started within the south, within his region, within Swaida, but soon spread across the country. This story is not just important for the Druze of Syria, but is also part of the story of the creation of the state of Syria as we know it today. But by 1927, the revolt was crushed, and Al-Atrash himself was sent into exile. There is a quote that's attributed to Al-Atrash that is said to come from this period, and it's a quote that so signifies what this revolt was about, but also painted a revolutionary conception of nationhood within this very diverse region. Religion is for God. The fatherland is for all. And so fast forward to 1945, with the end of the Second World War, with France greatly weakened, Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, along with many other militants, kicked out the French and claimed independence, which it was granted with full recognition in 1946. And so after sacrificing so much and engaging so militantly for this independence, Al-Atrash expected autonomy, or at least like a bigger seat at the table during this early independence period. But what happened was the opposite. The Druze, alongside most other minorities across Syria, were sidelined, as the new administrations were increasingly Damascus-centric. A lot of these tensions between the central government in Damascus and the provinces, specifically here with Swaida, really came to a head in the early 50s. The then president of Syria was a man named Shishakli, and he was a military officer who saw Al-Atrash and the Swaida region as a belligerent province, one that needed to be brought under the heel of the central government. He implemented policies to try to cut out basic services and infrastructure to the Swaida region, and elicited resistance from militants in the Swaida province. And so what happened in about 1954 is that Shishakli sent in an estimated 10,000 soldiers into the Swaida province and heavily bombarded villages and towns and committed massacres and destroyed a lot of the infrastructure. By some accounts, Shishakli also encouraged Bedouin tribes to plunder the defenseless neighborhoods and essentially run amok. Soon after, Shishakli was overthrown in a coup and went into exile in Brazil. 13 years later, he would be assassinated by a Druze man whose parents were both killed by Shishakli's bombardment of Swaido. The next 10 to 20 years in Syria is a series of coups, much like a lot of what was happening in the region, especially somewhere like Iraq, but we'll just concisely jump to Hafiz al-Assad, essentially the final coup to end all coups. Hafiz al-Assad took over the Ba'ath Party and then took over Syria in 1970. He would rule the country for 30 years, and essentially he played the sectarian system very well. He allowed the Druze to have a relative autonomy, and he made sure to sort of curry favor with the Druze elites by allowing some of their players to be within the regime. So that can mean high-level officers within the army, or people that have access to state infrastructure and state services, the like. Essentially, what Hafiz did was create cooperative ties with local leaders, and in that way would kind of quell any tensions. But of course, all this comes with the fact that he ruled the country with an iron fist, and created one of the most notorious prison states the world over. But so fast forward, in 2000, Hafiz dies. Before that, the heir he actually wanted to take over died in an accident, so instead you get this guy. And here again, we'll skip over the first 11 years of his presidency, and with the outbreak of the revolution in 2011, most people in Swaido, most Druze, were cautious. At the beginning of the revolution, most people in Swaido did not protest. You did not have these huge scenes of protests like you did across the country. But eventually, some people in Swaido did start joining the newly formed Free Syria army that was engaging in armed struggle against the state, against the regime. It was also around this time that people in Swaido began to refuse forced conscription into the Syrian regime army. Because as they saw, this army was doing nothing but killing other Syrians. And so what happened is these local militias began popping up that would both prevent forced conscriptions and protect against attacks from new Sunni extremist groups that were appearing across the country. But again, as opposed to what happened in most of the rest of the country, the Assad regime never directly attacked Swaido. However, in 2015, the leader of the most notable militia in the Swaido province, Men of Dignity, was assassinated in a car bomb. Many blame this assassination on the regime, who only saw this militia as an obstacle to increase their ranks in their army. In 2018, ISIS staged multiple attacks across Swaido, which killed 260 people. Again, many suspect the regime enabled this to happen, seeing it as further punishment for their refusal to join the army. Then, in 2023, a wave of protests erupted in Swaido against the regime, sparked by an ever-worsening economic situation. These protests lasted essentially up until the fall of the regime, and so, in December 2024, when HTS and other groups were on a lightning military campaign from Idlib that had liberated Homs and Hama, local militias in Swaido began forming a coalition with other militias in the south. On December the 6th, they announced the formation of the Southern Operation Room, which liberated their own areas from regime remnants and headed towards Damascus. It was these groups that first entered Damascus, only to withdraw when HTS arrived from the north. And so now, since Shara appointed himself the new president of Syria in what is described as a transitional government, many Druze, like all other minorities in Syria, were very worried. And the events of March and July of this year have confirmed some of people's worst-case scenarios. Especially what happened in July, which began as petty clashes between Bedouin tribes and Druze militias, soon spiraled out of control. The so-called Ministry of Defense from Damascus were sent, not to alleviate tensions or to act like a neutral third party, but to side with the Bedouins against the Druze. What this amounted to essentially were massacres against Druze civilians and sectarian killings. Most painfully for me, the footage of these Sunni extremists armed, grabbing a Druze sheikh and forcing him to shave his mustache. In a very twisted play of history, the sectarian torture mechanisms that were used against Sunni militants are now being done by those very same militants to Druze minorities within Syria. By that, I mean the regime used to literally grab some of these men and shave their beard and camera, tell them to bark, humiliate them, and kill them. And so there's this twisted, cyclical thing that is playing out now in Swaido. And just for the sake of objectivity, because I'm not going to go that much into details about what happened in Syria in July, I am very aware that the Druze leader, El-Hejeri, did commit crimes. That there was not only massacres against the Druze, but also forced expulsions and killings of Bedouin civilians. But of course, I have to be objective, and seeing the situation as it is, even though it feels so gross to do, there is an imbalance in the amount of violence, in the real risk that the Druze faced, not just surrounded by antagonistic forces, but also by a new state, a new regime that has openly declared its intents to isolate the region and send fighters, and a lot of people are just being super sectarian against the Druze, and it's really, really scary. But aside from the details of this present moment, there's so much about what's happening that reminds me of exactly what I was describing when I was talking about Shishakli. As in, it's kind of the same situation. A new central government in Damascus attacks the Suwaida province, also in alignment with Bedouin militants, in order to bring it under its domain, in order to create a state with a monopoly of violence within the state, which is centered in Damascus. Basically, what I'm seeing playing out in my analysis is a fundamental contradiction within the formation of the Syrian state, one that is determined to be Damascus-centric, but in reality is multipolar, is multi-ethnic and multi-religious. But yes, now we do not have the cool leader daddy like Sultan al-Atrash. Instead, there's this pretty shady character called Hikmet al-Hejeri. Also, to talk a bit about al-Hejeri, he not only cooperated with the Assad regime, some of the generals around him are Assad generals. He is also the guy who has openly called for Israel to intervene on his behalf in order to protect the Druze. But before all of these events, El-Hejeri was a pretty unpopular and kind of marginal figure within Swaido. But after the literal siege that is still ongoing in Swaido, there has formed a siege mentality, and so new coalitions have formed around him, even by his former political opponents. The Druze in Syria at the moment feel very surrounded. And I mean, they are surrounded. Not just in Swaido, but also those that live in the suburbs of Damascus. If you go online, and especially for those that read Arabic, there is so much sectarian discourse against the Druze that openly call for their extermination. And so, of course, I'm disgusted by El-Hejeri and his actions. I'm disgusted by his appeals to the US and to Israel, and I'm disgusted by the very fact that there are more people now carrying and waving Israeli flags in protests in Swaido. at that same protest that saw a lot of these Israeli flags, people started talking about independence, that they want to secede from the Syrian state. This to me is all incredibly terrifying and upsetting. But again, those massacres, the siege, these are what upset me more. And if anything, if there is one driving factor pushing the Druze in Suwaida, in Syria in general, into the arms of the Israeli enemy, it is al-Shara himself, his administration, and anybody who is engaging in sectarian actions, killings, and even just hate speech online. Like Shishakli before him, I see Shara wanting to humiliate and subdue the Druze, something that they refuse to do. And so, with all of this talk about the Druze of Suwaida, and specifically under al-Hijri, siding with Israel against Shara, there is this very powerful clip of this woman in Suwaida expressing very different beliefs that to me affirm that there is opposition in Suwaida to al-Hijri and his collaboration with Israel. For Palestinian Druze, it's an altogether different story, because ultimately, it's a far smaller population that mostly reside within the Galilee region in the north of Palestine. Here we're talking, in today's terms, no more than 100 to 150,000 people. As far as I could find, there are very few to basically no large political historical figures that come from these communities that otherwise seem to steer clear of political engagement. A lot of them were feudal peasants who focused more on the land and, that year's harvest. A good example of this is their lack of involvement within the 1936 Palestinian revolt against not only the British, but also the early Zionist colonization of their land. And in line with how much 1936 kind of foretold what would happen in 1948 with the Nakba, there too, Palestinian Druze did not put up much of a fight. There was some resistance at the hands of Druze communities, but those were mostly in combination with Druze from Suwaida under Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, but that quickly fell apart, especially because they were not given the support from the Arab armies that were claiming to be fighting to protect Palestine from Zionist takeover. And so here it is a bit sad, because even in 1948, there were some Druze that joined the Haganah, what would soon be the IDF. Most, however, remained neutral, and were focused on their own survival, and again focused on that year's harvest. They were worried that if they fought against the Zionists, without any equipment or serious ability to do any harm, that they would be expelled from the land, much like a lot of other people around them. And so, with the creation of the State of Israel, the Druze, like all other 48 Palestinians, that is, those that were not expelled or granted Israeli citizenship, were placed under military rule. This would go on till 1966, and what it meant was the state was able to, without justification or without any due process, steal land, conduct military tribunals against civilians, and basically all 48 Palestinians had any civil rights and freedom of movement stripped from them. Starting in the 50s, the Israeli regime began to create a new distinct identity for the Druze as a way of a kind of divide and rule, to create essentially a loyal minority. And then in 1956, the Israelis began implementing forced conscriptions for Druze men over 18 into the Israeli army. This was met with opposition, even by the Druze leaders who had otherwise cooperated with the Israelis, such as Sheikh Amin Tarif. Tarif even threatened to excommunicate any Druze that volunteers within the Israeli army, and mobilized Druze women to stop their children from conscripting. Funny enough, Sheikh Tarif also refused to sanction any marriages that involved soldiers, seeing conscription as a threat to the community's reputation. But it seems with time, those voices of opposition quelled and were co-opted. Sheikh Tarif would go on to have a very friendly and cooperative relationship with the Israeli regime until his death in 1993. In 1990, he was awarded something called the Israel Prize, being one of the very few non-Jews to receive such an accolade. Ultimately, the Druze were granted relative privilege compared to other 48 Palestinians, but of course not as much as Jewish Israelis. Most Palestinian Druze still see themselves as Arabs, but there is increasingly this identification with something called Israeli Druze. But this, according to polling numbers, is still a very small minority compared to the majority who still identify as Arabs. And despite the fact that there is forced conscription, there are many Druze Arabs in Palestine who refuse to conscript into the army, even though doing so means spending at least 3 months in prison, in a military prison. The numbers that the Israeli regime provide for how many Druze Arabs join the Israeli army is conflated and contested by a lot of people who are familiar with how the system actually works. And how it works is, as soon as you turn 18, you are conscripted into the army instantaneously. And so even if you refuse and you end up going to jail for your refusal, statistically, you are still seen as someone who is in the army and refusing to cooperate. But with that said, it is something to bear upon, that yes, there are Druze Arabs who are killing Palestinians in Gaza, who are participating in the Israeli genocide against 2 million Palestinians. And that is the most condemnable, disgusting thing any person can do. I don't care if they're Druze or Mizrahi or Ashkenazi. They are genociders. But yes, with that said, we are talking about a minority population. All told, it's like 1.5 of the entire population. And so statistically, there's not that many that are engaged in this open warfare. But it is just clear that anyone participating in this is just, it's really beyond description. But yes, just to take a step back because I'm about to wrap up this section, I don't have that much more to say. But before I move on to the next section, I do actually have 2 very specific references for understanding the Druze within 48 Palestine. The one is another book by the Palestinian Druze scholar Firro. This one's called Druze in the Jewish State, which initially I was like, about the title, but then I discovered from another Palestinian historian talking about this, that he used that title in order to gain access to the Israeli archives. And so the book is really powerful, and its analysis is really sharp, and its archival sort of sources is just very good. The other recommendation I have for this section, it's not necessarily about the Druze themselves, but I think it really reflects onto this discussion. It's a film by the Palestinian filmmaker Anne-Marie Jasser that was made in 2017. It's called Wajib. It's a sort of meditation on this sort of inter-Palestinian, very specifically inter-48 Palestinian discourse between a kind of rejection and a forced acceptance of living under occupation as so-called Arab citizens or Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. Those are my 2 big recommendations. Highly recommend them. Moving on to the next section. So I wanted to end this section by talking about the Golan Heights, where this video started to begin with. The Golan Heights is Syrian territory, is Syrian land that was taken by the Israelis through military conquest in the War of 1967. The Golan Heights would then be formally, as in legally within the Israeli system, annexed in 1981. This annexation and subsequent attempt at integrating the population proved to be very difficult for the Israelis because the inhabitants of the Golan Heights refused and rejected and resisted assimilation. After annexing these territories, the Israelis offered all the residents access to Israeli citizenship. What happened in response was a call for protest and for strikes, and that manifested into a historic 6-month general strike that was launched by inhabitants and workers within the Golan Heights. En masse, Druze villagers in the Golan Heights refused Israeli citizenship and the identification cards given to them by the Israeli state. And of course, there were clashes between residents and Israeli security forces. What this amounts to is that by 2010, 29 years after annexing the territory, only 10% of Syrians within the occupied Golan Heights accepted Israeli citizenship. But by 2020, that number jumped to 20%, largely influenced by the instability caused by the Syrian war. But still, the vast majority of those in the Golan Heights have refused Israeli citizenship, even though what they have really doesn't allow them to travel. They're basically travel documents whose status is written, not defined. The Druze of the Golan Heights still see themselves as Syrians, despite, or perhaps in spite, of the fact that successive central Syrian governments never fought for them, never fought to get them back under Syrian control. Even today, the Syrian neglect of the Golan Heights continues under Sharia. There's to me a deep irony about the fact that Sharia chose the nom de guerre, Jolani. A, he is not from the Jolan. B, he clearly used the name to indicate his opposition to Assad as a kind of lamentation of Syrian loss, which also implies opposition to Israel, who occupied this land and has taken it from the Syrians for the last 40-50 years. But since taking power, Sharia has not only smeared the Druze people, not only has he sent people under his command to commit atrocities against the Druze, he has also done nothing for the people, for the Syrians of the Jolan. Quite the opposite. While the Israelis are expanding their occupation of Syrian territory through the Golan Heights, Sharia and his administration have been holding talks with the Israelis. Literally just a couple of weeks ago, the Syrian foreign minister met with Israeli delegations in Paris. And so, as a result of the massacres that have taken place in Sweden, as a result of the sectarian discourses against the Druze by the new Sharia administration and those around him, more and more Druze in the Golan Heights are filing for Israeli citizenship. Many online are remarking that what Israel has not been able to do in 60 years, Sharia has done in 60, which is push the people in the occupied territories of the Golan Heights into the arms of the occupation. This, I think, says so much about the status of the region at the moment. Ultimately, what I think the Druze of the Golan make clear is how Israel tries to constantly weaponize the Druze identity to its own advantage, painting itself as a protector of minorities against barbaric Muslim hordes. But so too, the Druze of the Golan demonstrate the hypocrisy of the Syrian state, both now under Sharia and then under Bashar, and before him, Hafiz. So that's that. That was a long one. That was a lot of information. I hope any of you have made it this far, and if you have, thank you. I hope you appreciate this video. I hope you learned something about the Druze, and I hope it'll help you now read the news with a bit more of a human touch. I have such a hard time with how so many discussions about our region is just inherently dehumanizing, like with this emphasis on geopolitics or ideologies or religions. In a lot of ways, I think looking at the Druze kind of helps exemplify a basic tenet of all people, but specifically here, all people within the region, which is people who just want to get on with it, who want to live in freedom and dignity. I think in a very basic way, when it all boils down to, is basically that. It's what I think many of us take for granted. But I'm not about to get all soppy and philosophical at the end here. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, leave a comment, ask me absolutely anything, but just please don't be like sectarian or shitty in the comments. And check out my Ko-fi, which is in the description below. If you like this video and you appreciate the work that I put into it and all the research on the presentation and the editing. I've been up for too long. Thank you for watching this, and I'll see you all in the next one.